You walk out of the meeting and you already know how it went. Again. You had the insight, the real one, the one that connected the thing the engineer said to the thing the finance person said, to a pattern you recognized from somewhere completely outside the room. You could see the whole shape of it, glowing, obvious. And you opened your mouth to share it, and somewhere around the third connection, you watched their faces change. The slight glaze, the polite nod that means, please land this plane. And you kept going because you could feel the insight slipping. And you tried to explain all of it at once, and by the end, you had said something true and important and watched the entire room file it under, they went off on one again. Then someone with half your understanding said one clean sentence, and the room nodded, and the idea became theirs. If you have lived that exact moment more times than you can count, stay with me. Because what just happened to you is not what you think happened. You did not fail to be smart enough. You did not fail to be clear enough in some deep way you can never fix. You ran into a specific, well-documented cognitive gap from the wrong side of it. And almost nobody has explained to you that the gap even exists, let alone how to cross it. And here's the part that should change everything. The skill you are missing is not be less of yourself. It is not dumb it down. It is not stop seeing so many connections. The skill is translation. And translation is a thing you can learn that does not cost you a single one of the connections in your head, and that turns the exact trait that gets you dismissed as scattered into the trait that gets you treated as indispensable. Because this is the rare video on this channel that is almost entirely tactical. I'm going to give you the actual frameworks, the phrases, the structure, the thing you can use in your next conversation tomorrow to take an insight that used to come out as word salad and land it like a knife. In the next few minutes, I'll show you the cognitive science of why your insights get lost and why it is happening from the opposite direction than most people assume. I'll give you 4 specific translation tools, each one named, each one usable immediately. I'll show you how to hold 10 connections in your head while saying only the one that matters without feeling like you are betraying the other 9. And I'll reframe the whole thing, so you stop walking out of rooms feeling like the smartest person nobody listened to, and start walking out as the one person who could do the thing none of them can. Stick around for the third tool especially. It's the one that solves the house of mirrors. If you've ever had a brilliant point die in your mouth while a worse version of it won the room, you've found your people. Subscribe and let's go. Why your insights actually get lost. Let's start with the science, because once you see it, you stop blaming yourself for the wrong thing. There's a famous experiment from Stanford, run by a psychologist named Elizabeth Newton. She had people tap out the rhythm of a well-known song with their fingers, and then predict how often a listener would guess the song correctly. The tappers, with the full melody playing vividly in their own heads, predicted the listeners would get it about half the time. The actual success rate was around 2.5%. The tappers could not imagine what it was like to hear only disconnected taps, because they could hear the whole song. The music was so loud in their own minds that they could not feel its absence in someone else's. That gap has a name. Psychologists call it the curse of knowledge. Once you know something, you lose the ability to imagine not knowing it. And here's what the research shows about the mechanism. When you master something, your brain physically reorganizes. The steps that were once conscious become automatic and invisible, even to you. An expert hears a single term and an entire web of connected concepts lights up in their head. The novice hears the same term and gets an empty label. The expert literally cannot feel the gap because their own brain fills it in instantly. Now here is the twist that applies to you specifically, and that almost nobody talks about. The curse of knowledge is usually described as a specialist's problem, the expert who can't talk to normal people. But you have a rarer, stranger version of it. You are not cursed by depth in one field. You are cursed by connection across many. When you have an insight, your brain is not lighting up one web, it is lighting up 6 webs at once. And the bright, obvious, glowing thing you want to share is the connection between them. But the connection only looks obvious if all 6 webs are already loaded in your head. The people in the room have 1 web loaded, maybe 2. So when you say the connection out loud, you are tapping a song that requires 6 melodies to hear, to people who can hear 1. You are not unclear. You are translating from a language with more dimensions than the one the listener is standing in. This is why the worse version of your idea wins. The person who said the clean sentence wasn't smarter. They were monolingual, in the room's native tongue, and so they spoke it natively. You are multilingual, and you made the classic multilingual mistake. You tried to say the whole thing at once in all your languages, and it came out as an accent nobody could place. You don't have a clarity problem. You have a translation problem, and translation is learnable. Tool 1. The Specialist Anchor. Here is the first tool, and it is the foundation for everything else. Before you say your insight, you find the listener's home field and you start there. Not in your synthesis, in their world. You open with something that is already fully loaded in their head, in their language, and you anchor the entire insight to that single point before you move anywhere else. The research backs this precisely. A 2026 study on communication in meetings found something important. When you explain everything to everyone, generic and complete, comprehension goes up slightly, but engagement crashes because people drown in definitions they didn't need. But when the explanation is filtered to the specific listener, fewer terms, only the relevant ones, anchored to what they already know, both comprehension and the listener's sense of your value go up, and engagement stays high. The lesson is brutal and freeing at the same time. Saying more is not the path. Anchoring to their world and saying less of the right thing is. So in practice, the move is this. You silently identify the one field the listener actually lives in. If you're talking to the finance person, you begin inside finance. If you're talking to the engineer, you begin inside the engineering. You take the part of your 6-web insight that touches their 1 web and you make that the doorway. You earn the right to bring in the other 5 webs only after you have stood with them briefly in the one they own. The mistake you have been making your whole life is starting in the synthesis, because the synthesis is where the beauty is, and the synthesis is where you live. But the listener cannot enter through the synthesis. They can only enter through their own front door. Anchor there first, always. Tool 2. The 3-sentence synthesis. The second tool fixes the part where you can feel the insight slipping and you start saying everything faster. You give yourself a hard constraint. The first thing out of your mouth is 3 sentences, no more. Sentence 1 is the anchor, in their language, from Tool 1. Sentence 2 is the single most important connection, just one, the one that matters most to this specific listener. Sentence 3 is the implication, the so what this means for them or for the decision in front of the room. That's it, 3 sentences. Then you stop talking. This feels impossible the first time because you have 9 more connections you can see, and they are all true and they are all relevant, and leaving them out feels like lying by omission. It is not lying, it is editing. Every great communicator is ruthlessly editing in real time, and the reason it doesn't occur to you to edit is that for your kind of mind, all 9 connections genuinely are live. So cutting 8 of them feels like amputation rather than selection. Here is the reframe that makes it bearable. The other connections are not gone, they are held. You are not deleting them from existence. You are choosing not to say them yet. And the 3-sentence version landed cleanly is what earns you the follow-up question. And the follow-up question is the door through which the other connections walk in, one at a time, invited in the listener's own time. You don't lose the 9. You trade saying them all at once, which loses the room, for saying them one at a time, which wins it. 3 sentences, then silence. The silence is not emptiness. It is the space where they catch up and ask for more. Tool 3. Managing the House of Mirrors. This is the one that solves the deepest part of the problem, the part that feels less like a skill gap and more like a curse.
You know the feeling. Someone says one thing and your mind doesn't produce one response, it produces 10. Every statement ricochets into connections across every field you've ever touched, and you are suddenly standing in a house of mirrors, 10 reflections of the same idea, all true, all bouncing, and you have a fraction of a second to decide which one to speak while the others keep multiplying. It is exhausting, and it is the real reason you sometimes go quiet in conversations entirely, or the reason you over-explain, because you are trying to honor all 10 reflections at once. Here is the discipline, and it is a discipline, not a trick. You learn to ask yourself one question, fast, before you speak. Which of these 10 is in the listener's world right now? Not which is most interesting to you, not which is most true, not which is the most beautiful connection. Which one lands inside the web the listener already has loaded? 9 of the 10 reflections, however brilliant, are in rooms the listener isn't standing in. Speaking them is not communication. It is you giving yourself a tour of your own house while a guest waits at the door. The skill is to walk to the one mirror that is reflecting something in the guest's line of sight and speak only that. And here is the part that makes this sustainable rather than suppressive. You are allowed to keep the other 9. You write them down after. You bring them to the people who can see them. You save them for the follow-up, or the document, or the one colleague who actually thinks the way you do. The house of mirrors is not the problem. The problem was only ever trying to show every mirror to every guest. You keep the house, you just learn to be a good host inside it, which means showing each guest the room they came to see. This is the move that takes you from feeling trapped by your own mind to feeling like the owner of it. The 4th tool is how you actually smuggle your full insight in, over time, without ever triggering the glaze. You adopt the listener's vocabulary on purpose, not because their language is better than yours, but because their language is the only one they can hear in. When you translate your cross-field insight into the specialist's own terms, 2 things happen. First, they understand it, obviously. But second, and more powerfully, they experience your insight as compatible with their expertise rather than as a threat to it. You are not the outsider telling them their field looks different from above. You are someone speaking their language fluently who happens to have brought something useful from elsewhere. This is the difference between here's a concept from systems theory that applies to your work, which makes a specialist defensive, and saying the same thing entirely inside the specialist's own vocabulary so that it feels like a natural extension of what they already know. Same insight, one version gets rejected as an outsider's intrusion. The other gets absorbed as an insider's contribution. The only variable is whether you bother to translate it into their vernacular first. This takes effort. You have to actually learn the basic language of the fields you work alongside, enough to speak the doorway sentences fluently. But for a mind like yours, learning the basic vocabulary of a new field is the single thing you are best at in the world. You collect fields, so collect their words too. Specifically, the 200 words that make a specialist feel you are one of them, and use those words as the bridge your insight walks across. The reframe that changes the whole game. Now step back, because the frame around all 4 tools matters more than the tools. There is a role that organizational researchers have studied for decades, and they have a few names for it: boundary spanner, knowledge broker, the translator.
The research is remarkably consistent about what these people do and how much they are worth. A boundary spanner is the person who moves knowledge across the walls between specialized groups, who takes what one community knows and renders it into something another community can use. And study after study has found that these people are critical drivers of innovation, that organizations with strong boundary spanners outperform on new ideas and execution, and, tellingly, that these people are often hidden, under-recognized, and quietly indispensable, doing strategic work that nobody quite has a title for. The role you have been performing badly and getting dismissed for is a documented, studied, high-value role. The reason you keep ending up as the informal translator between the engineers and the executives, between the creative team and the finance team, between the people who can't quite hear each other, is not an accident of your personality. It is the boundary spanner function, and you have been doing it on instinct without the training, which is why it has felt like failure instead of expertise. The 4 tools are not you becoming less of yourself to fit into specialist rooms. They are you finally getting trained in the role you were always being pulled into. The specialist goes deep in one field and cannot leave it. You move between fields and translate. That is not the consolation prize for failing to specialize. In a world of deepening silos, it is one of the rarest and most valuable functions a person can serve, and it is structurally impossible for any pure specialist to do, because they only speak one language. You were never the scattered person who couldn't communicate. You were the multilingual person in a building full of monolingual experts who never got taught how to translate. Now you're getting taught. One honest note. A quick, honest word before the close. If the experience of being dismissed in rooms has gone past frustration and started to convince you that you are fundamentally stupid or worthless, or that your mind is broken in some way that can't be fixed, please be gentle with that and consider talking to someone you trust or a professional. Years of being misread can leave real marks on how you see yourself, and those marks deserve care, not just better meeting tactics. The tools in this video can change your conversations. They are not a substitute for repairing the deeper story if the deeper story has gotten heavy. You were always the translator. So let me leave you here. For years, you have walked out of rooms carrying the quiet conviction that something was wrong with the way you communicate, that you were too much, too tangential, too hard to follow, that if you were really as capable as you sometimes suspected, the room would have understood you. You took the glaze on their faces as a verdict on your mind. It was never a verdict. It was a translation gap. The music was playing so loudly and so beautifully in your head across so many fields at once that you couldn't feel its absence in theirs. So you tapped the rhythm and assumed they could hear the song. They couldn't. Not because they were lesser and not because you were standing in a language with more dimensions than the one they were standing in, and nobody ever taught you how to translate down into it without losing what made the insight worth sharing. Now you have the tools. Anchor in their world. 3 sentences, then silence. Speak the one mirror that's in their line of sight, and keep the other 9 for later. Build the bridge out of their own words. None of it costs you a single connection. All of it lets the connections finally land. You don't have to become smaller to be understood. You have to become a translator. And the translator, it turns out, was always the most valuable person in the building. They just didn't know what to call you. If this gave you something you can actually use in your next conversation, subscribe and join a community of people learning to turn the way they think into the way they're heard. And I want to know in the comments, what is the field you most often find yourself translating between? The 2 worlds you keep ending up the bridge for? Drop them below. I read these, and I suspect a lot of you are going to recognize each other. Thanks for watching. Now go translate something that used to get lost.